Hello and welcome. I'm Debbie, and thank you so much for spending some time with me today. Last week, I looked a bit at the developing digital economy that is being promoted by the White House, Congress, and many bureaucratic agencies, most notably the Federal Reserve. This week, I looked into other economic initiatives and policies and thought I would share some of these other economic considerations with you today. Now, please note, I'm not an expert and I miss a lot of information, but I try to check the credible sources behind the information I am finding or from which I want to draw the information. But again, not a professional economist or anything, but there is a lot of information we can find. Now, while we may want our own national sovereignty to be the sole determiner of our economic policies and all that is entailed therein, there are numerous other organizations whose jurisdictions supersede that of our own government. For example, the WTO, or World Trade Organization, sets policies that all member nations have to follow. According to WTO.org, the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, is the only global international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. At its heart are the WTO agreements negotiated and signed by the bulk of the world's trading nations and ratified in their parliaments. The goal is to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. The website provides further insights to the role and authority of the organization. When teaching about the global economy, I would address the International Monetary Fund, which is better known as the IMF, and which I always reminded my students was not the impossible missions force as featured in the Mission Impossible movies. Okay, bad teacher joke, I get it. Anyway, found at imf.org, its mission is the International Monetary Fund, IMF, works to achieve sustainable growth and prosperity for all of its 190 member nations. It does so by supporting economic policies that promote financial stability and monetary cooperation, which are essential to increase productivity, job creation, and economic well-being. The IMF is governed by and accountable to its member nations. The World Bank, worldbank.org, cites since 1947, the World Bank has funded over 12,000 development projects via traditional loans, interest-free credits, and grants. So there are multiple organizations to which member nations are bound that rely upon wealthier nations to follow policies and rules in order to help build the economies of other nations and allow developing nations a voice and stake in the greater global economy. But now there are newer economic policies and ruling bodies, governing bodies, that are furthering these economic developments, and they could have a far greater impact of all of us. The Davos Conference and its manifesto, which are from the World Economic Forum, which is weforum.org, and Agenda 2030 from the UN. Now, from the UN site, the Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is an agenda of unprecedented scope and significance. It is accepted by all countries and is applicable to all countries. All countries will implement this plan. We are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and to heal and secure our planet. All countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership are determined to take the bold and transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path. As we embark on this collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets which we announce. And then they go on to list the 17 goals, and then they go into the subpoints or targets within each of those goals. So subpoint 1.4, by 2030, ensure that all men and women, in particular the poor and the vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources, as well as access to basic services, ownership, and control over land and other forms of property, inheritance, natural resources, appropriate new technology, and financial services, including microfinance. In my opinion, the language is that of socialism, and the subpoints to the 17 goals provide more specific information as to the impact of the goals. Now, the World Economic Forum, and they just finished their conference in Davos, Switzerland. So, the World Economic Forum is the international organization for public private cooperation. The forum engages the foremost political, business, cultural, and other leaders of society to shape global, regional, and industry agendas. And then it states, as we enter a unique window of opportunity to shape the economic recovery, this initiative will offer insights to help inform all those determining the future state of global relations, the direction of national economies, the priorities of societies, the nature of business models, and the management of a global commons. Drawing from the vision and vast expertise of the leaders engaged across the forum's communities, the Great Reset initiative has a set of dimensions to build a new social contract that honors the dignity of every human being. So the WEF wants to totally reset the global economy. The WEF itself sees itself as the governing economic policy for all nations, and that the governments of the world will subscribe to their policies and follow their direction. One can spend hours and hours researching all the organizations and policy groups that have input as well as control over the economy and social order of member nations, including our own. Now, I'm not an alarmist, but I do think it is important for us to understand the priorities and goals of these policymakers, and that we may not have any input into any of these decisions, as the policymakers are not elected officials and therefore not answerable to us. In other words, their constituents are themselves, and the people who have to follow their policies are the rest of us. As always, I recommend everyone to conduct their own research, which is why I do reference the sources of the information that I share. You most likely have a better understanding of these issues than I. I am just bringing them up and introducing them to us. Now, one of the stated purposes of this channel is to offer encouragement. And so I encourage all of us to look to God and the prophetic messages and passages in the Bible that have foretold these developments and events. For those of us who are Christians, our hope and trust is in the Lord, not in the government. For those who are not Christians, I do encourage you to read Scripture and test the truth of the words and of God. Psalm 62, 5 through 8 states, "Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from Him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in Him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to Him, for God is our refuge." I hope that this week will be wonderful for you. And I promise to not focus on economics next time. Maybe. Anyway, thank you so much for spending some time with me. Thank you so very, very much.